Go ahead. Look at yourself. Not in the mirror they handed you. Not in the reflection their opinions carved. Look in the one place they never controlled. The one you rebuilt from the wreckage they were certain would bury you. Because something happened to you. Something they did not predict, did not plan for, and cannot explain. You changed. Not the kind of change people announce. Not the kind with a dramatic speech or a public moment. The quiet, irreversible, terrifying kind. The kind that happens underground, in the dark, while everyone above you is certain you're finished. And now you've surfaced, and they don't recognize you. And that, right there, is the most powerful thing that has ever happened in your life. And before we go any further, if everything you're about to hear resonates in your bones, there is a book built for exactly this moment. The Joker Doctrine, the art of the last laugh, the philosophy of the one who smiles last, the one who was counted out, written off, laughed at, and then laughed last. Loudest, permanently. Link is below. Now, let's get into what they were never prepared for. They built a version of you in their heads. They constructed it carefully, brick by brick, from every rumor they spread, every narrative they crafted, every time they nodded along to someone else's lie about you. They decorated it with your worst moments. They furnished it with their own projections. They lived in that constructed version of you like it was permanent, like it was the truth, like it was the final word on who you were and who you'd always be. And you let them. For a while, because you were too busy actually becoming something to stop and argue with people who had already made up their minds. But now they've seen you, the real you, the after, and every single one of them is standing there with their mouth open and one question they don't know how to say out loud. Who even are you now? Not because you've become unrecognizable in the shallow sense, but because the person standing in front of them carries something they cannot name, cannot source, cannot take credit for, and cannot touch. You are not the version they eulogized. You are not the story they rehearsed. You are something that was forged specifically because of everything they tried to do to you, and that is a truth that will haunt them longer than any silence ever could. This is not a glow-up. Glow-ups are surface. This is a structural overhaul. This is a resurrection from the inside out. This is what happens when someone takes every single thing meant to end them and uses it as raw material. And we are going to talk about exactly what that means. Every layer, every shift, every quiet, devastating transformation that happened while they thought you were falling apart. Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything. Let's talk about who you were to them. Because they had you filed away, didn't they? Neatly categorized. Safely labeled. You were the one who needed them. You were the one who could be managed. You were the one whose opinion they could dismiss, whose achievements they could diminish, whose pain they could overlook, because they had already decided your ceiling and it was conveniently lower than theirs. And here is the most disturbing part of all. For a season, you half believed them. Not all the way, never all the way, but enough. Enough that you second-guessed yourself in rooms where you deserved to be confident. Enough that you apologized for things that were not your fault. Enough that you stayed smaller than you were, not because you lacked the size, but because the environment kept reminding you to shrink. They didn't do it with cruelty every single time. Sometimes it was subtle. Sometimes it was a laugh at the wrong moment. A slight hesitation before they complimented you. Well, you're doing okay considering. That trailed off just enough to plant doubt without being accusable. Sometimes it was the kind of dismissal that wears generosity as its mask. I'm just being honest with you because I care. And you'd absorb it. You'd go home and replay it. You'd wonder if there was truth in it. And while you were sitting alone, dismantling yourself, trying to find their point, they had already moved on, unbothered, unaware of the damage left behind. Because here is what they never told you, and what you were never supposed to figure out. The people who study your weaknesses the hardest are always the ones most terrified of your strengths. They weren't critiquing you out of concern. They were mapping you out of fear. They needed to know where you were fragile, because they were building a case. Not a formal one, not a legal one. The kind built in whispers and group chats and between us conversations. The kind designed to ensure that if you ever rose, there would be enough noise ready to drown it out. And they almost succeeded. Almost. But they made one mistake. They underestimated your capacity to feel everything, survive everything, and come out the other side, not broken, but clarified. They thought pain would dissolve you. They thought isolation would defeat you. They thought the weight of being misunderstood by the very people who claimed to know you best would be enough to shut you down permanently. But pain doesn't dissolve people who were built for pressure. It refines them. It removes what was never essential. It strips the performance and leaves only the truth. And when the performance fell away, what was left was you, the real you. And that was the thing they never prepared for. They thought they were watching a collapse. They were watching an excavation. And what got excavated was so much more dangerous to them than anything they had planned for. Because you were not who they told you that you were. You never were. And now the proof is standing right in front of them, breathing, composed, and done explaining. Nobody talks about this part. They talk about the breakthrough. They talk about the glow-up. They share the after photo and the quote and the triumphant moment. But nobody sits in the middle of the story, in the part with no light yet, in the season where it was just you and the weight of everything, and talks honestly about what that required. So we're going to, because that season is not a footnote, that season is the thesis. There was a period where you didn't know if you were going to make it through. Not physically, but intact, whole, still recognizably yourself on the other side of it. There was a period where the loneliness was not just social, it was existential. Where you sat with the version of yourself that had been stripped of every external validation and had to decide, with nothing to lean on but your own core, whether that core was worth staying committed to. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most profound things a human being can face. And you faced it without applause, without documentation, without anyone holding the door open for you. And in that silence, something began. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was more like a very slow, very deliberate reorientation of every internal compass you carried. You stopped asking what they thought. You stopped rehearsing explanations for people who had already written their verdict. You stopped auditing yourself through the lens of people who were always going to find you insufficient because sufficiency in you threatened something in them. And in the space where all of that noise used to live, something else grew. Something that had been trying to grow for years but kept getting crowded out by the desperate need to be understood by the wrong people. You started to hear yourself. Really hear yourself. Not the performed self. Not the self that had been shaped and reshaped by years of other people's expectations. The actual self. The one with opinions you'd been softening. The one with boundaries you'd been apologizing for. The one with a specific kind of intelligence and a specific kind of knowing that you'd been dimming because the rooms you were in couldn't handle the full wattage. That self didn't emerge suddenly. It emerged like a tide. Slow, inevitable, impossible to stop once it had started moving. And while it was moving, while you were quietly rebuilding in a way nobody could see, your absence was doing something to them. Because here is what happens when someone who was once accessible to you becomes unavailable. You suddenly notice how much you depended on their reaction to feel powerful. You needed them to defend. You needed them to explain. You needed them reactive, engaged, caught in the web. And when they stopped reacting, when the silence stretched and you couldn't provoke the response you expected, you started to feel something uncomfortable, something you didn't want to name. The beginning of irrelevance. And there is nothing more terrifying to someone who used power over you as an identity than the slow realization that you no longer need their permission to exist. That silence you were living in was never weakness. It was construction. And what got built in there, they are only just beginning to understand. Let's be exact about this, Because ascension is a word that sounds abstract, and what happened to you was anything but. It was specific. It was earned. It was the result of a series of unglamorous, invisible choices made on days when choosing the opposite would have been so much easier. And it deserves to be named precisely because the people who tried to prevent it will never fully comprehend how it happened. The first thing that shifted was your relationship with being misunderstood. For a long time, being misunderstood felt like a wound. It felt like failure. Like if you were just clearer, just more articulate, just more patient in explaining yourself, eventually they would get it and the validation would arrive and you could finally exhale. And then, one day, and it's hard to pinpoint exactly when, you stopped wanting their understanding. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. You realized that the version of you they were misunderstanding was a version you had been maintaining for their comfort, and that you were exhausted from maintaining it, and that the moment you let it go, the moment you stopped explaining and just became, something in you that had been clenched for years finally released. The second shift was your relationship with being alone. There is a version of alone that is deprivation, and there is a version that is sanctuary. And somewhere in the middle of everything you went through, you crossed the line between those two versions without fully realizing it. You started to not only tolerate your own company, but to prefer it. Not because you became antisocial, but because you discovered that solitude, real solitude, is where calibration happens, where you hear the thoughts that get drowned out in noise, where you figure out what you actually want, separate from what you've been told you should want. Where you meet the version of yourself that exists without performance, and you decide whether that version is someone you can respect. You decided yes, and that decision changed the entire trajectory. The third shift was your relationship with time and proof. You stopped needing to prove yourself on their timeline. You stopped trying to demonstrate your worth in formats they would find legible. You let go of the urgency to be seen as successful by people whose definition of success was built to exclude you. And once you removed that urgency, you moved differently. You made decisions based on where you were genuinely going rather than what would look best in the short term to the people watching. And ironically, that slow, unbothered, internally oriented movement produced results that external performance never could have, because it was real. Because it was rooted, because it was built on something they couldn't destabilize with an opinion. And now you are standing inside the life that was assembled from those invisible shifts. Not the life they predicted for you, not the cautionary tale they were drafting, the one that got built in the quiet, the one that nobody had a hand in but you. And they are looking at it with the particular bitterness of people who thought they had closed a door, only to discover that you had already built another building entirely. This is not a comeback. Comebacks imply you went somewhere. You were always here. You were just building. Before we go any further, we have to talk about the most dangerous opponent you faced in all of this. Not them, you. Because there was a version of you that could have become everything they said you were. There was a version that could have hardened into bitterness, built an identity entirely around grievance, turned every interaction into a retaliation, made the wound the centerpiece of everything, and worn victimhood like armor, because at least victimhood keeps you safe from the risk of trying and failing again. That version was available to you. The door was wide open. And on some days, you stood at it for a long time, but you didn't walk through. And that is not a small thing. That is actually the thing. Because the greatest act of resistance against people who try to diminish you is not punishing them. It is refusing to become what the pain wanted to make you. It is refusing to let the heat twist you into something ugly. It is staying soft where they needed you to harden, staying open where they needed you to close, staying curious where they needed you to become defensive and small and consumed. Because a bitter person is a predictable person, and predictable people cannot ascend. They can only orbit the wound. You outgrew the wound, not by pretending it wasn't there, but by refusing to let it be the headquarters of your identity. You processed it. Maybe slowly, maybe imperfectly, maybe in ways that nobody saw or acknowledged. But you metabolized the pain instead of housing it. And what your body makes from processed pain is not weakness. It is something closer to iron, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that only becomes visible under pressure. And the pressure came, and you held. There were also people you had to outgrow. Not enemies, people you genuinely loved, or thought you did, or wanted to. People who were not malicious, but were also not capable of holding the version of you that was trying to emerge. People whose love was conditional on you staying the same, on you being manageable, on you needing them in a way that confirmed their importance. And walking away from that kind of love, or letting it reconfigure into something lower stakes, is one of the most quietly devastating things a person can do, because it requires admitting that sometimes the people closest to you are the ceiling you keep bumping your head on, and you chose the ascent over the comfort, over the familiarity, over the version of yourself that would have been easier to maintain if you just stayed where everyone expected you to stay. You chose the version that terrified you a little, the one that had no guarantee, the one that meant being the person in the room who had done the internal work that nobody else had bothered to do. That choice cost you things, real things, and it gave you something in return that cannot be purchased, borrowed, inherited, or faked. It gave you yourself, fully, finally, irrevocably. Let's be honest about what they're looking at when they look at you now, because they're not just seeing a different version of you, they are seeing the evidence of their own failure. They are seeing, in living and breathing form, the proof that everything they said about you was wrong. Every ceiling they installed, you walked through. Every label they assigned, you outgrew. Every narrative they circulated, your existence dismantles without you having to say a single word in response. And that is unbearable to a specific kind of person, the kind who needed you to be the warning, the cautionary tale, the person they could point to and say, see, that's what happens. Because if you're not that, if you're actually standing here transformed and grounded and moving with a kind of quiet authority they don't recognize, then what were all those years of judgment for? What did it say about them that they were so certain and so wrong? What does it mean about the stories they've been telling about themselves if the story they told about you was so catastrophically mistaken? They are watching you, and they are doing arithmetic they cannot make come out right. They invested years of energy into a particular conclusion about you. Years of conversations where they were the expert on your limitations. Years of positioning themselves as the people who saw through you. And now the conclusion they were certain of hasn't arrived. And all that energy sits in them with nowhere to go. And it turns, inward, outward, into whatever direction is easiest. But it eats at them. Because the only thing worse than being beaten by someone you despise is having to stand there and watch that person never once lower themselves to your level in response. Your composure is the most devastating thing you could offer them, not because it's strategic, but because it's real. You are not composed because you're suppressing rage. You are composed because you genuinely don't need anything from them anymore. Not their apology, not their acknowledgement, not their revised opinion. You have closed that account entirely. And when someone looks at you and sees that their opinion of you holds absolutely no weight in your world, when they see that they could construct 1,000 more narratives and it would change nothing in your orbit, that is an erasure more complete than anything revenge could deliver. You're not trying to make them feel small. You don't need to. The contrast between who you've become and who they were certain you'd be is doing that entirely on its own. This is the part that needs to be said plainly, without metaphor, without softening. You have taken over your own life, completely. In a way that is so total, so fundamental, so rooted, that nothing from the outside can dislodge it anymore. And that is what this title means. Not a hostile takeover of someone else's world, a sovereign reclamation of your own. Because there was a time when your life was co-authored by people who didn't deserve the pen. When your confidence was outsourced to people who had a vested interest in keeping it low. When your direction was shaped by the fear of being judged by people who were already judging you regardless of what you did. When your decisions were filtered through the imagined reactions of an audience that never once considered your well-being in return. That was the life before. That was the occupied territory, and you took it back. The takeover looked different than anyone expected, because it was not announced. It didn't come with a declaration or a confrontation or a public moment. It came in small, quiet acts of self-reclamation. The day you stopped explaining a choice to someone who hadn't earned the explanation. The day you looked at an opportunity that scared you and took it anyway without asking anyone's permission. The day you made a decision that was purely in alignment with where you were actually going rather than what would look acceptable to the people watching. Each one of those was a line of code rewritten. Each one was a brick of the old structure dismantled. And slowly, so slowly that you didn't fully realize it was happening, the entire architecture changed. And now look at what you're building. Look at the territory you're operating in. Look at the decisions you make without flinching. Look at the rooms you walk into without apologizing for the space you take up. Look at the conversations you exit the moment they stop serving your growth. Look at the standards you hold yourself to, not because someone told you to, but because you have developed an internal code that has nothing to do with external approval and everything to do with who you have decided to be at your absolute foundation. Nobody handed this to you. Nobody cleared the path. Nobody scheduled the transformation or gave you a roadmap or held your hand through the worst of it. You built this under fire. You built this while being doubted. You built this while managing pain that other people would have used as a permanent excuse to stay exactly where they were. And here is the full truth of it. You were never waiting for the right conditions. You were never waiting for the right support. You were never waiting for them to finally see you and change their minds and give you permission to thrive. You just started and kept going and didn't stop. That is not luck. That is not talent. That is not something you were simply born with. That is a choice, repeated daily, in the direction of your own becoming. And the result of that choice is standing here right now in a life that belongs entirely to you, carrying a version of yourself that nobody designed but you. And they are watching. Let's not pretend otherwise. The people who wrote you off, the ones who gossiped, the ones who smiled to your face and built narratives behind your back, the ones who were certain of your expiration, they are watching. Not openly, not with acknowledgement, but through whatever window they have access to. Through mutual connections, through social platforms, through the kind of casual but loaded. So how are they doing? That they drop into conversations, hoping for news that confirms what they predicted. And they are not finding it. They are finding instead a person who moves with a specificity and a certainty that reads as something they don't have a word for. They are finding someone who is no longer available for the dynamics they used to access. Someone who is not angry, not performing healing, not posting declarations or cryptic references to what was done to them. Just someone who is oriented toward something real, something that clearly costs nothing to the outside world, but everything in terms of integrity, focus, and irreversible forward motion. This is what they cannot reconcile, because they expected aftermath. They expected the visible wound. They expected you to carry it loudly, the way people who were not rebuilt by the process tend to carry it. They expected that what was done to you would define the texture of everything that came after, and instead, you used it as fuel and then stopped talking about the fire. You extracted what the hardship had to teach and then moved forward. Not because you're not human, not because it didn't hurt, but because you made a decision somewhere in the middle of the dark that the story would be about what you built, not what was burned. And now they have to live with the fact that they are not part of your story anymore. Not as villains even, just as irrelevant. As people who came, did what they did, and got left behind in the momentum of someone whose trajectory they never believed in. That is the ending they were never prepared for. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a public moment of justice, just the slow, dignified, undeniable evidence of a life they told everyone would fail, flourishing, quietly, completely, without them. You don't need to say a word to them. You already have, with everything you are now.